Now time for a little bit more of a serious interview. We're going to talk to Vali Nasr. He is the author of Forces of Fortune, The Rise of the New Muslim Middle Class and What It Will Mean for Our World. It's a lovely book. We'll put it up on the Young Turks library at theyoungturks.com. Everybody go crazy and buy it before you even hear the interview. All right. Vali, welcome to the Young Turks.
Thank you for inviting me.
We appreciate you coming on. Now, you're saying that we have a problem, we have a solution to the problems coming out of the Middle East. And it's our old friend that Michael Moore has written or done a whole movie on, capitalism. He sees it as a little bit more problematic, but you see it as a solution here. What are you driving at here? How can capitalism help us with the Middle East?
Well, whenever we look around the world, when we see countries that have embraced democracy, that have stable social, political systems, that have peaceful relations with their neighbors and the world, all of their economies are based on relatively free commerce and trade with the world, interacting with the global economy, giving and taking to the global economy, and they have vested interest in good relations with everybody else. This is what worked in European history. That's how Europe became what it is. That's what's worked for us in the United States, that the stability of our democracy is based on the power of our markets. And in the past 2 decades, that is what has brought India, China, Latin America, and Eastern Europe into the mainstream of world life.
We're talking to Vali Nasr. He is a professor of international politics at Tufts University and a former adjunct senior fellow to the Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, that's an interesting point and one that I very much sympathize with. But does it lead to a counterintuitive conclusion? So instead of doing sanctions on a country like Iran, should we instead inundate them with trade?
Well, with the situation with Iran, and there are many others around, there are always immediate crises that we have to solve, and sometimes the solution to them would require tough decisions. But the issues that we've dealt with the Muslim world in the past decade, say at least since 9/11, when we've tried to put our mind around our relationship with the Muslim world, are much larger than one country. We think that the Muslims are marching to a different drummer. They are not integrated into the global political, economic relations. They are anti-Western, and to solve that bigger problem, which then will help solve smaller problems like the one in Iran or Arab-Israeli issue or other crises that we face, must be that that if you're going to have people have good relations with the world order, they have to have a vested interest in it. They have to participate in it. So, we have to come up with ways of, in the long run, building economic relations with people in the Muslim world so that they trade with us and buy and sell things from us, and that their income and their prosperity depends on access to that trade. Sanctions is a very specific solution to a very specific problem. It may work, it may not work. But it's not a long-run answer to the whole problem of America and the West's relations with the Muslim world.
I want to get to how we're going to do that in a second. But first, I got to, conservatives, their heads have to explode over this theory. I mean, partly they got to like it because, hey, capitalism rocks. Let's do it. Let's spread it everywhere. But the other way of looking at this is your proposal is, hey, let's make the Middle East richer. And that'll be a way that we can avoid going to war with them.
Well, richer people everywhere are also more democratic, are more culturally open, and are more interested in peace and security and making money. I mean, ultimately, if you want people in the Middle East not to be thinking about war and confrontation and terrorism, not that a lot of them do, but even those who do, if you want their mindsets to shift to other things, as it's happened in Latin America or Eastern Europe or India, even if you want them to adopt a more moderate interpretation of the religion, there's no other force that gets people to do that other than commerce. When people have a vested interest in the world and in making money in the world, then, they adopt ideas and values that accommodates that. So, we can sit here and preach all we want about how the Middle East ought to change, be less of a threat, have friendly relations with us, abandon anti-Westernism. But it's not going to get there unless the same forces that worked in other parts of the world and also worked in European history work over there. I mean, I don't believe that we should sort of deny the fact that there are some serious problems between us and the Middle East, and that anti-Americanism, anti-Westernism, extremism, fundamentalism are serious problems over there. But those problems will only go away if people change their mindset, and people only change their mindsets by the power of commerce.
Professor Nasr, first, look, we do an opinion show here, so let me give you my opinion.
Please.
I agree with you 100%, disagree with you 0%. I think that's exactly right. I think that's part of how it worked in South Africa, that there was enough people, ironic because we had sanctions on South Africa, but there were enough rich people with vested interest in trade with the rest of the world that they thought, all right, well then the policy of discrimination is not worth it because it's affecting my bottom line. Right. So if you create enough rich people, funny enough, and then you affect their bottom line, they're going to be highly motivated to get that bottom line to be a little bit better, right. and that makes international relations easier and makes it part of the system. So I agree with you.
But not all kinds of rich people. I mean, rich people who make money just because there is oil revenue coming in and the government is giving them good deals are not the right kind of rich people. You want rich people like the ones you mentioned in South Africa, who depend on whose wealth comes by selling things to people outside. So I mean, if you're manufacturing furniture, or if you're building, components of electronics, and you need to sell it to people in the West or people in Asia, then your wealth depends on good relations with other people, and then the people who work at your factories depend on good relations with the rest of the world, and people who collect taxes from you and taxes from your employees depend on good relations with the rest of the world. I think that's the best way to get good relations with the rest of the world, moderation, democracy, positive attitudes, actually find enduring presence in countries.
Right, and but there's a chicken and egg problem here, because how do you get these countries engaged in international trade, then thereby have the leverage of being able to threaten their international trade and get them to be part of the international community that way? Because, I mean, let's break it down again to very specific, real examples. What do you do with Iran? Iran is an issue, obviously, for us here. Do we have more trade with them at this point? It seems a little counterintuitive. Right. So walk me through how we do it.
No, absolutely. Your point is very well taken. Let me say that, we're dealing with some 3-4 dozen Muslim countries and 1.3 billion people. There are countries like Turkey, Malaysia, Morocco, that are much closer to being able to be turned, if you would, using commerce and trade, and would bring them into the mainstream of world affairs, institute democracy in them. And there are countries that are much farther away. I mean, this idea will not for now work in Somalia. And there are countries in the middle, and there are some countries like Iran, with which we have some hard issues that we first have to solve before we push this forward. But it was the same way with Asia and Latin America. I mean, all of Latin America or all of Asia didn't change at once. First, there were the countries that were the low-hanging fruit, that were readier, actually made the transition. They became a model and a driver and an example for other ones, and then they followed them. The same happened in Latin America. We don't need to change the whole of the Muslim world at once, and it's definitely not a good idea to start with the most difficult cases first, because then chances of failure is a lot higher. You should look and see which countries are readiest to actually be integrated into the world economy. Maybe it's Turkey, maybe it's Malaysia, maybe it's Morocco, maybe it's Jordan.
So, okay, but I want to look. There's two things here. It's a different level. So if you say, hey, Iran's too hard, we'll work up to that, I hear you. On the other hand, Turkey's too easy. You give a couple of carrots and sticks, and if they pass certain thresholds, then you invite them into the European Union, problem solved, okay? But let's talk about something that's maybe a little bit more in the middle, like Syria. Now, you have basically one guy, one family ruling the country, and he wants to keep as much of the money for himself and the people that are supporting him and the generals as much as possible. How do we get through to that country? How do we invite them into the world community especially when they're, again, doing some bad acts like they did in Lebanon.
Right. Well, you see, the bad acts we have to deal with, but always the question is, what do you do the day after the bad acts are over? You know, you still have to get that country, which is ruled by one person, one family, ultimately open up to the world. And it's going to require patient, continuous engagement. Even the easy country of Turkey that you mentioned, it took Europe and IMF over a decade of patient, forced change on Turkey to gradually change, which means that every engagement we have with Syria, every economic interaction we have has to establish conditionality that they gradually remove their trade barriers, that they engage in reforms that create space for the private sector, that then we have to find ways of supporting that private sector, including opening our markets to it, including encouraging foreign investment to it, encouraging our allies to engage in it. And then ultimately, once that private sector begins to grow, then it would become a force of change from within in that country. And it's not I mean, trade and the way in which it changed Western history never happened overnight. It's a process. You ultimately have to create a segment of society that in some countries exists, in some countries is very small, and in some countries they don't exist at all, that are most likely to be friends of the West and most likely the proponents of positive change, and let them essentially change the region. I mean, we've tried going into wars to change the Middle East. It hasn't worked. We've preached to them. It hasn't worked. We've tried to use hard power. It hasn't worked. And ultimately is that we're trying to change policies in the region often without really spending much time in changing the region from within, which is the best way of changing it. And
right.
That change has to be economic. Ultimately, you're not going to change countries unless you change their economic profile.
We're talking to Professor Vali Nasr. He is the author of the best-selling book, The Shia Revival, and his new book is The Force of Fortune, The Rise of the New Muslim Middle Class and What It Will Mean for Our World. So now let me talk about the downside of capitalism, though. Let's assume that your plan works, Professor Nasr. Mm-hmm. And then at the end, you have these, rich interests that are doing trade with the outside world, et cetera, et cetera. But then, within all those countries, you will develop some of the problems we have here, such as the military-industrial complex. And what happens when Syria, Iran, et cetera, Saudi Arabia, develops their own military-industrial complexes, which are motivated to go to war for more profits?
Well, economic historians would tell you that, capitalism is not a sort of a one-way street. It's not always good. Too much of it is not a good thing. It causes income inequality or causes problems like the ones you mentioned. Too little capitalism is not a good thing either. We saw that in the communist socialist world as well. And, throughout the Western history, we'd always try to find a balance. Either through taxation, through regulation. Even we're seeing that with Wall Street right now. We're trying to regulate Wall Street because unimpeded capitalism caused the crash that we saw last year in the financial markets. But that's not the Muslim world's problem. The Muslim world's problem right now is not too much capitalism. It's too little capitalism. I mean, when they become capitalist, then they would have to deal with those problems. They would have to regulate their financial markets. They have to tax their wealthy people. They have to address income inequality, and they also have to address the rise of military-industrial complexes and the like.
So,
but they're not there. I mean, that's a problem way over in their horizon right now. There's too little capitalism rather than too much, and much of the problems we see in that region are a symptom of this.
Right. Now, before we let you go here, in the brief amount of time we have, I am curious to go back to an earlier point on what conservative reaction has been to the book. Because on the one hand, you're pushing for capitalism, and they got to love that. On the other hand, you're saying we need to make these countries richer, which they're not going to love that. So what's been the reaction to the book?
Well, the reaction it's too early to tell, but the reaction is not that we're making these countries richer. The reaction usually has been that Muslims are incapable of capitalism.
Oh, come on.
Or that the problem is Islam, is not the capitalism. I argue in my book that the battle for the future of the Middle East is not going to be over religion, it's going to be over markets. And there is plenty of evidence that whether it's in Turkey or Dubai or Malaysia, that when Muslims have been in an environment where they can do trade and commerce, they do well in it. And when they do well in it, it is a force for moderation and a force for democracy. So the most democratic and the most moderate parts of the Muslim world are the ones that are most integrated into the global economy. So the argument that the problem in the Middle East is Islam and that until the Muslims secularize, nothing's going to change, I disagree with that because I don't see any evidence of that. And I think actually if there's going to be a force for secularism, again, much as it happened in Western history, it will come from the forces of commerce and the rise of a middle class with commercial interests and commercial values.
Right. Money secularizes folks in the long run anyway. And, of course, the biggest religion of all is the God of money. So
that's exactly right. Yeah.
So people will come around to that. All right. The book is Force of Fortune. It's from Professor Vali Nasr. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
It was great being on your show. Thank you.
All right.